Hello, everyone. This is Leah Feldman, daughter of Daniel Feldman, who is the main character in our podcast, A Good Run. I am introducing episode 4. Episode 4. That's what Escher's here for. I'm introducing episode 4, where Dan, my father, talks about his father, Henry Feldman, who, in his telling, is responsible for what, I guess, Dan refers to as his moral compass, his code of ethics, which, of course, as a politician, plays a large role in the substance of his legislation and his political bend, I would say. So I really enjoyed the opportunity to speak to him about this, for all intents and purposes, truly incredible person who, unfortunately, I never got to meet, died before I was born, but was obviously a key influence in my father's both professional and personal life.
Hey everyone, it's Asher Feldman. So Leah, obviously Henry Feldman had a huge family. Mm-hmm. Did you guys get into any kind of dynamic or how obviously a very family-oriented man kind of influenced the way that Dan feels about family?
Totally, yeah. So in addition to having this really large family, my grandfather, Henry Feldman, he had this large family of about 8 siblings, and they ran a business together. So not only were they a large family that was very close in their familial affairs, they also were invested in the business altogether. And the way that played out, the sort of particular influences of the family bond among these people while running this business, and I should mention quite successfully, was really, really fascinating. It definitely explained to me, or sort of described to me, a little bit of how the Feldman family came to look like and represent the things that they do, and even influence my father, some of his economic policy and his sort of business role. But definitely the large family played a big role.
That sounds awesome. I can't wait to listen.
Yeah. So everyone, I hope you enjoy this episode of A Good Run, and we will see you next week. I'm sitting with my father, Dan Feldman, for the 4th installment of our podcast, A Good Run. We are talking today about something that's slightly less political than things we've discussed in the past, but an important influence nonetheless. As any of us in our professional lives know, much of what we do in our business is a reflection of things that influenced us in our younger lives, most specifically our parents. So we are today talking about your father, Henry Feldman. This blog post actually begins by recognizing that this is not necessarily a political conversation, but more about the background of your political career. Would you more or less say that's correct?
Yeah, I guess that's right. I mean, there's some political aspect to it. That's mostly right.
Right. So in one of the first paragraphs, you mentioned that, to sort of connect this to your political life, he had a sort of running insistence on a sort of mute relationship with yourself, with your accomplishments and self-praise.
Well, mute is that's a little strong.
Yeah.
He said some things,
yeah.
But I don't really, where were you going with this?
I mean, I'm curious to know how someone who, in your own words, you refer to the, sometimes, and maybe not always, discussing his, self-praise was anathema.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So, I mean, how does one come from a background like that and remain a politician? I mean, politicians sort of have to sell themselves.
Well, I remember listening to a repeat or a broadcast of a taped interview I had done on the radio, listening with a girlfriend of mine before I got married. And she heard me say on the radio, more or less what we were just talking about, what I picked up from my father was that self-promotion, blowing your own horn is ungentlemanly. It's not an appropriate thing to do. And I picked up some of that, and of course that's a huge handicap for a politician. So my girlfriend looks at me a little skeptically, and reading her expression, I said, yeah, I know. I would rather have been saying it on television. The point was, I very much like, publicity and people being aware of me. I just didn't want to be the one to initiate it.
Right. So given the opportunity, you wouldn't say no. It's not something you would necessarily...
Right, but even so, successful politicians, the preeminent example being Schumer, people in politics today, at least in the United States, people don't tend to pay attention to you unless you really make an effort for them to pay attention to you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's not that somebody comes to you and says, oh, you're so wonderful, let's interview you. And of course, since that hardly ever or never happens, I was under a severe handicap.
That's fair. Well, you make it very clear that your father experienced a great deal of success in his life. He was... successful in his business, which was design.
Yes, but he never became wealthy. And many interior designers with far less ability or talent became very wealthy.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it wasn't one of his priorities.
Wealth was not a priority?
No. The business was his interior design business. They didn't just design things, they made them. They made furniture, draperies, and so forth. There were certain guiding principles that he felt had to be followed. Principle number one, the employer, and he had about 40 employees, the employer was responsible for the well-being of his or her employees and their families. If there's something left over for the boss, that's fine. If not, too bad. So that was first principle. Second principle, it's not really the client that's the important judge of quality. It's you, the designer. And so meeting the client's requirements was easy. Meeting your own requirements, meeting your own standards is much more challenging. And so my father would see to it that every project they did met his standards of artistic quality.
Which I assume were
very
quite high. Yes.
And not necessarily allowing much of a profit margin because the client only wanted to pay for what they wanted.
Right.
Also, while most interior designers would have one theme or maybe two or three themes and all the projects were variations on that theme, that wasn't sufficiently interesting for my father. So they would come up with a new creative theme for each project.
Wow.
Again, involving far more effort, investment, time, and money and so forth, and not allowing too much profit. So those two principles alone would have limited their profitability. But according to my mother, there was a third one. And as she described it, any bum with a halfway plausible story would get a handout when they showed up at Feldman Brothers. So my father, of course, wouldn't put it that way, but they were quite generous. So look, they supported many families. They put all their kids through college, but they never made much money, even though their clients were some of the wealthiest people in the country. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Auchinclauses. These were, and later Seligman and Latz, Saks Fifth Avenue, many of the major hotels in New York. They had top. Oh, the Greek shipping line owners. I don't think they had Onassis, but they had Batera, Sajanaki. Many of the great shipping line owners were their clients.
One of the things that I noticed when I was reading this post is, well, I'll phrase it to you first and see if you can come to the conclusion yourself.
Okay.
Had your father's personal ethics been somewhat different, do you think that he would have been more successful in a sort of layman's understanding of the word successful?
He would have been more financially successful. Clearly, yeah. But he was very successful in his own terms.
Right. So according to how he did, he did all right.
He did fine.
Right. Yeah. Now, can you guess what my next question is?
Would I have been more successful politically?
Had your personal ethics not been so...
Well, but the same way. I would have been more successful by common standards, but not maybe by mine. I was, in the sense that I was in elective office for 18 years, and I feel good about what I was able to do. I think I did anything that was inconsistent with my conscience, and that's one measure of success. Yeah, would I have liked to have won my congressional race, or ideally, what I really wanted to, where I really wanted to be is a member of the U.S. Senate. Given my political deficiencies, I now know that was never in the cards.
Yeah, but I mean, even as a child, I was able to notice that you were very unhappy when you met failures. Yeah.
Yes, I was, sure.
And however, it was on some levels of your own doing.
Yes.
And so doesn't that strike some sort of dissonance for you? I wonder if it struck a similar dissonance for your father.
No, I don't know. First of all, understand my father came from very poor. I mean, their family had really no money. I mean, but although, as he said, they didn't know they were poor because everybody else was just as poor as they were. You know, they didn't have TV like now, so you could see all the rich people. They thought everybody was like that. So to go from the kind of poverty he grew up in to the middle class life that he ended up with was pretty good. Yeah. And he, mingled in really the highest levels of American society with his clients. Many of whom became his friends, his employees loved him. He had a business where everybody did pretty well and was satisfied. And I don't know if it was most important, but certainly high among his priorities, he did good creative work, which is what he really wanted to do. So I don't think he had a lot of regrets.
And you?
On balance, I don't either. Yes, I was miserably unhappy when I lost those elections, but frankly, my life turned out pretty well.
Good. Well, I'm sure your father would have felt the same. And even, he lived long enough to see you create the successes for yourself that you wanted.
Yeah, well, I actually had a conversation with him along those lines. When I lost the district attorney race in 1989, again, very upset. And I spoke to my father, and he said, well, you're an elected official. You're doing good work. Do you have to be so unhappy about this loss? And I said, well, look at Chuck Schumer. Look at all these other successful politicians. I'm not achieving at that level. And he said, your mother kind of brought you up to kind of keep whipping yourself forward. And it was useful, he said. But, enough is enough. Give it a break. You did fine. So that's a message that I still occasionally have to remind myself of, but, it was a pretty intelligent response.
That makes sense. Yeah. We talked a bit during, not our last post, the second post, about your mother and her influences on you.
Right.
And it seems like, although the two of them were similar in a lot of ways in terms of their thinking process, they had very different influences on you.
Yes.
No one is, clearly black and white. No one's one half their mother and one half their father, whatever their parental structure is. Do you think that your father's influence on you was somehow more deeply ingrained than your mother's influence?
I don't know if one was deeper than the other. It was certain. I don't think it's any less deep, but when I wrote my first book, Reforming Government, which was in part about the work I had done, the dedication was I said in memory of my mother who gave me the spirit, and in honor of my father who gave me the strength. He was still alive at that point. She wasn't. But that's kind of how I see it.
Oh, I'm glad I asked that. So back to sort of the substance of the post. There were a couple personal habits of your father's that you mentioned, and they seem to be of importance. However, to the casual reader, you might not necessarily understand why. I'm thinking of the sort of last paragraph in the post where you discuss the fact that for most of your life, your father had a habit of smoking one cigarette after dinner, and then one
year. One a year.
One a year.
Yes.
All right. So, and then you noticed
generally it's around April. He would smoke his annual cigarette.
Yes, and you noticed one April that this did not occur.
Right. So he said, "Oh," I said, "Dad, what happened to your annual cigarette?" And he says, I gave it up." He quit smoking.
Quit smoking his one cigarette a year.
Right.
And then later on in that same paragraph, you discuss something that was diagnosed by a doctor as a heart condition, which turned out not to be true, but for which was prescribed one shot of whiskey after dinner.
Right.
And which, again, you noticed that he stopped.
I said if he did this for about a week, he would drink like this thimble full of whiskey, of scotch. It was scotch, right? I think it was before dinner, actually. Well, I don't remember. Anyway, he drank this tiny little thimble full of scotch for about a week, and then at the end of the week, he just stopped. And I said, what happened? He says, oh, I couldn't deal with all that drinking. I mean, he would have an occasional glass of wine or a beer, but that was it for hard liquor.
So, what's the significance of these little...
Well, interestingly, he was, for a number of other stories, for a number of other reasons, I remember very distinctly his response to one piece of legislation that I introduced, which he didn't approve of, and that was it was actually the Schmidt-Feldman bill. I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna digress a little here.
Sure, please go ahead.
My seatmate in the assembly for many years was a guy named Freddie Schmidt, who I was one of the most conservative, if not the most conservative member of the Assembly, more conservative than most of the Republicans, very, very right-wing Democrat. I had known Freddie slightly before I got elected, and he was hilariously funny. The guy would have me in stitches. It was such a treat to sit next to him. I really liked Freddie a lot, but he was way to the right. Anyway, he put in some bill basically banning magazines with, sexually explicit covers from supermarkets. And of course, the bill couldn't go anywhere. It's grossly unconstitutional. So this was a problem in my district too, because in these little bodegas, these little stores, which people go for a container of milk or, they would have these magazines with these very sexually explicit covers, just like a sea of them, and you have to sort of wade through this to get your container of milk. And it was annoying to my constituents, and frankly, it was, I don't know, it was slightly annoying to me too. It was just, well, give me a break. Do I have to, okay, but am I required to, go through this stuff? So I said, Freddie, I think I could, rewrite your bill in a way that it might pass muster. And he said, great, do it. So basically the bill said that you can sell it, but you have a choice. You can have a magazine rack in which the title is visible but the picture isn't, or you could have an adults-only section of the store, or I forget the third possibility, but all three were an accommodation so that you could sell it, people could buy it, but other people weren't forced to encounter it. So the bill became law, Schmidt-Feldman law. My dad took issue with it, and he was himself, completely prudish and straight-laced, would never, have any dealings with stuff like that. But he said to me, those pictures for those magazines are their advertising. And to the extent that you make it more difficult to see the picture, people who want to buy them don't necessarily see them right away. It hurts their ability to, and as a matter of free expression, he said it's a little problematic. Now, my dad was a high school graduate, never went to college, and as I used to say, when my mom went back to school, I used to say to my dad, Mom went back to college, got a degree, why don't you? But he says, yeah, I'll enroll in 4th grade, because he considered himself very uneducated. His argument against the bill was more sophisticated, more intelligent, more persuasive than the arguments from my Ivy League educated colleagues from Manhattan who debated the bill on the floor. But what I guess the point I'm making is that his own personal style was practically Puritan, but politically he was, very sensitive to American, Central American values like free expression. He was a smart guy.
Well, smart, but also what that seems to me more than intelligence is a level of compassion,
yes,
or sort of an ability to sympathize with or empathize really with people that were very different from him.
Absolutely,
which is really a very impressive trait.
Actually, that empathy expressed itself in explicitly political ways. Very rarely, I remember only 2 political issues. Specific issues in which he actually cared enough to focus on those issues. One was it was called the Humphrey Hawkins bill, which guaranteed employment to everybody. In other words, if you couldn't get a job, the federal government would employ you in a manner. And his strong belief in that bill was because he truly empathized with the pain of unemployment. Something which I experienced twice in my life for very brief periods and was agonizing to me, as I know it would have been to him. and so that was one. The other was all I think came from personal experience. School nutrition programs, so that there were any federal program that provided lunch or breakfast, meals in school for poor children. He very strongly supported it, and now he himself had gone to school hungry on occasion, and he very well understood that it's very difficult to learn if you're being distracted by hunger. And so those are two issues I distinctly remember. My mother would talk about every possible political issue under the sun. Those are the two that I remember him talking about. When you talk about empathy,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, those are. I mean, the hunger issue is something that he himself experienced.
The unemployment, I don't think he did.
Right, but that's almost even more impressive.
Yeah.
Because he understood without experiencing the agony of it, and that's I think maybe even more impressive.
Yeah.
But if I remember correctly, there was a nutrition bill, a free food program that you yourself were involved in.
Well, yeah, that was the summer food program scandal. This later on. In my investigative life. This was a a summer food program for poor kids that the vast bulk of the money that was supposed to support it was being stolen, and the kids never got the food.
Oh.
And so I was the principal investigator in that program, and when I was working for Liz Holtzman, and we not only sent 17 people to prison, but quite effectively reformed the program so that actually in subsequent years did achieve its purpose.
Well, it exists now.
No, yeah, sure.
Yeah, and it's very successful.
Yes, as far as I know, it's still clean. But this is 40 years later.
Wow. Well,
this is the 40th. This summer is the 40th anniversary of our investigation.
Wow.
Right.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Wow, what a legacy.
Yeah, it was a nationwide program, and it was
really.
Oh yeah. This was a big deal.
Huh.
And one of the people that was convicted of corrupting the program was a member of Congress.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Dear, that's a shame. My last question for you is, again, a little bit outside our general scope of political interest, but I'm curious to know, you mentioned in the post both your father's very short stature, he was just a shade under 5 feet, and his success as a basketball player.
Right.
He was very successful on his high school team.
Yeah, my father was very athletic. He's very short, obviously. He never said he was 5 feet tall. He always said he was 4'11 3/4, which is
never claimed extra quarter inch.
But he was an extremely good athlete, and of course people were shorter in those days, but he was short even by those standards. And he was captain of his basketball team. I guess it was a high school team, and they used to play other teams. And I remember he told me they did very, very well, except when they played some team from a deaf school. And he said the deaf students would hand signal from across the court. So they his team couldn't figure out what they were doing. And so he lost to that team. But he was a superb athlete. He was he boxed, he skied, any sport he tried, he was good at. So.
Well, I wonder, the basketball example sticks out to me a bit because he was given such sort of the circumstance that maybe would not provide for a great basketball player. However, it didn't scare him away. I mean, he remained interested and succeeded.
Well, as you know, there were a couple of NBA players who were short.
Right.
I mean, very few. There was one who was 5'6".
Yeah, Muggsy Bogues.
Yeah,
those lines. Right. But I wonder what that means.
We're eating lunch up here, FYI.
I wonder what that means for his ethics. How does that reflect some aspects of his personality, the ability to say, yes, I'm, not the typical basketball player, and yes, I'm going to be the captain anyway.
Well, I think whatever he did, he just strove for excellence, and whether or not now in a basketball game, other people can see it. But I think the story that I know we're coming to a close. The story that I'll leave this with, I think, not only illustrates something important about him, but something that was a huge influence on me. And it's when I was 5 or 6, he was doing some woodwork in the house, which of course he knew how to do. But he was working on the inside of something that was not going to be visible from the outside, and he was working hard on it. And I said to him, "Daddy, why are you working so hard to make that perfect when nobody's going to see it?" He said, "Because I'll know."
Yeah.
And I think the whole thing about not looking for publicity and striving for excellence and so forth, and you yourself being the most important ultimate judge of quality.
Yeah.
That story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Breaking down on that.
Understandably. I mean, and I know we're about to be out of time, but I do have to mention that as a member of, legacy of truly impressive Feldman men, I see a lot of the things that you praise so highly in your father and you. I would consider myself lucky to maintain some of those aspects myself. So that is how we will conclude this session of A Good Run. Thank you for joining us, and we hope we will see you again next time. Thanks very much.
Thank you.